like 500 kilometers than 300 kilometers. So they're extremely expensive pipelines. And they have limitation of diameter as well. So, of course, there is gas there, but it's not going to be cheap to bring it to shore. And I'm sure many of you have been reading in the press, and I think it's been talked yesterday in the oil session. Petrobras is actually in the midst of a big scandal related to corruption. Prices, to make it things worse, oil prices are going down. So this projection, which were made by Petrobras last year in 2014, they're going to have to be revised down. And if the oil production forecast is revised down, so will be the gas production forecast. So how much? We don't know. We're doing scenarios at the moment, but things are changing by the day in Brazil. So we're not sure what will happen, but it will not be 4 billion barrels per day in 2020, that's for sure. Now, if the pre-salt is not going to deliver because Petrobras is under stress, because it's an expensive area, can we look in onshore? I mean, like you said, Peter, there are a lot of resources. Actually, the IAEA made a study and just looking at just 3 basins in Brazil. Actually, the recoverable resources were quite large, and many in Brazil. 2 minutes. And many in Brazil actually thinking that the onshore natural gas will be the response to the increase in demand and to the penetration of natural gas into more inside areas of the country. But there are a series of barriers for this to happen. The Group of Energy of the University of Rio de Janeiro just completed an extensive study on what are those barriers. I'm summarizing here the results. I participated in that research, very interesting, but there are low geological knowledge, problems with environmental licensing, lack of financing for the project. Companies that actually get involved in onshore gas are not very large companies with a lot of cash flow. They need loans, and there aren't loans available for this sort of risky business in Brazil. Lack of infrastructure to bring the gas to the market, etc. As well as a moratorium in many states against unconventional gas. And so because of all these, we do see a lot of potential, but actually it will need some very specific policies and regulatory changes for that to happen. This is just to show why the lack of gas infrastructure may hinder this development. As you can see, no pipeline close to those areas. But there is some hope because the wires are actually more generally distributed in Brazil, and so gas to wire could be an opportunity. But there are some peculiarities in the Brazilian power system that have hindered so far this solution. So what we're left is import from Bolivia, and the question is, can it be sustained? Can it be increased? Or LNG? And a lot of projects actually are looking at LNG supplies because there is uncertainty about domestic supply. Okay, I've already said that, but LNG is a costly option. It's bought on mostly, it's currently bought only on short-term contracts, spot contracts, so it's been very expensive, and that actually means a strain on the commercial balance for Brazil. So all in all, that's my concluding slide. There are many uncertainties for the Brazilian supply scenario, both on the side of the imports for Bolivia, on the side of pre-salt production, and onshore production and LNG imports. In the end, I think we know that demand equals supply, but there is an increased prospect in most of these 4 areas, but the question is the timing. There seems to be delays in pre-salt production, delays in onshore production. Imports from Bolivia may not increase; they could even decrease in the short term, in the medium term. So in the end, our view is that LNG imports will actually have to fill the gap. Thank you.
Directo para Mauro. Sí. Gracias. Sí. Perfecto. Buen día. En primer lugar, quería agradecer al comité académico por haber seleccionado mi trabajo para participar de la sesión plenaria. El día de ayer, por ejemplo, escuchamos en la presentación de Gerardo Rabinovich y también en la de Elder
and also in Eric Quiro's presentation, the importance of energy integration in Latin America. For physical integration, energy integration, first of all, we need to have a country that will have excess supply, another country that will have demand that isn't covered by internal supply. In previous presentations, we've seen that Argentina would have with its reserves and undiscovered gas, natural gas deposits, along with shale gas, would have the most natural gas resources in Latin America. Agustin Catariese was also measuring the financial difficulties for developing these resources. Venezuela would be in the next place. The problem with Venezuela is also a financial problem. It's very difficult for them to develop heavy crude from the Orinoco Basin, and it will be even more difficult for them to develop natural gas resources. And then we have Bolivia. Bolivia is possibly the country that, in terms of natural gas, is the most integrated in Latin America. And that's the reason why it's important to study it in greater depth. This country has probably grown the most in economic terms in recent years. Its GDP growth has tripled from 2000 to date, and according to the International Monetary Fund, it's the country that will have the greatest growth in the region. However, much of its economy depends on its hydrocarbons industry. When I talk about its hydrocarbons industry, I'm not talking about oil. Its oil production is really only 5,000 barrels a day. I'm talking about liquid natural gas and natural gas, basically. Its exports in 2013 were $6 billion. That represents half of Bolivia's total exports. The government aims to expand its domestic natural gas consumption. And how is it doing this? Via programs that subsidize the use of natural gas. For example, there's a program for transportation conversion where the government pays for installation and equipment so it's free for users. And natural gas reserves have increased slightly. Basically, it's been a review. However, its ratio of reserves per production have reduced from 22 to 14 years between 2009 and 2013. And currently, hydrocarbon investments has basically been focused on developing already discovered fields. There's a very low investment in exploration, and so this question was actually on Sylvie's last slide, and it was whether Bolivia could attend future domestic and international natural gas demand in future years. Well, this work has a goal of answering this question. To answer, future scenarios will be elaborated for natural gas demand in Bolivia and for its exports, and finally achieving a supply-demand equilibrium. This is the methodology we've used. Our time horizon for demand is 2030 using LEAP software. Basically, we've classified demand as residential, industrial, services, and transport, which are the new major consumers. Power generation, that has a very important role, and exports to Argentina and Brazil. In the residential sector, we've used the bottom-up approach, and the driver has been households. We've used specific natural gas consumption for cooking and water heating. Bolivia isn't like Argentina that has significant heating use, and so we haven't included that usage. Our database has been the 2012 census, and as you can see here, the results of 2012 show that 10% of homes use natural gas for cooking, and conservatively we've projected that in 2030 35% of these homes will be covered by natural gas. This is conservative, considering that in Argentina 56% of homes use natural gas for cooking. In the industrial commercial sector, we can't use a bottom-up methodology because of a lack of data, so we've used a top-down methodology. For this, we've used sectorial natural gas consumption for the IAEA, and also Bolivian Real GDP series from the International Monetary Fund. This is initially non-stationary but integrated first differences. This lets them be co-integrated, and so yes, they are co-integrated, as was shown by our Johansson test. And finally, we use an error correction system that gave a long-term elasticity of 1.4. We compared with other studies from other colleagues in the hydrocarbons industry of Bolivia. They had a long-term elasticity of 1.3, 1.35, so our model fit. Within the major projects, we have to highlight the Bolo Bolo project, which is a petrochemical plant that has as a finality the production of ammonia urea, which will be used at another plant to produce fertilizers. The latest estimation for it to come into operations, for it to be operational, indicate that it will be operational as of 2016. The consumption would be 1.4 million cubic meters per day, according to IPF. For the transport model, we used basically it's a corporate function. It was developed by an English academic and published in the Energy Journal. The equation here looks bad, but I can explain it. Basically, this model indicates that there is a maximum saturation of a fleet, which they use the United States as reference, 850 vehicles per 1,000 users, and not all countries can reach that. The main driver would be per capita income, and there are certain econometric adjustments based on other countries' histories. These are the results of our model in terms of vehicles per 1,000 people. As from $10,000 to $20,000 per capita per year. vehicle ownership starts accelerating in countries. We've also made projections based on self-regression models on depending on the types of vehicles. In Bolivia, and the same thing happens in Ecuador, SUVs have a larger penetration than conventional sedans. This doesn't happen in Brazil, for example, but these have a larger consumption a lower mileage, and a percentage of cars that use natural gas will increase 50%, and this is also relatively conservative. For the expansion of power generation, we use our reference was the optimal expansion plan of the National Interconnected System, drawn up by the Hydrocarbons and Energy Ministry from 2012 to 2022. We've observed that in 2013-2014, the work has been delayed, and so we've delayed our model by 1 year. So, as you can see in Bolivia's generation expansion, this is mainly hydroelectric plants and thermoelectric plants, and that's open cycle thermoelectric. Why is this? Because natural gas is so cheap in Bolivia that it doesn't really work for combined cycle. With regard to natural gas exports, Bolivia exported to Brazil 30 million cubic meters per day, and to Brazil 24 million cubic meters. The Petrobras contract is under a 21-year contract starting in 1999, and it will have to be renegotiated in 2019. This is important for the future projections that we're going to make. And it also has an interruptible contract of 2.6 million cubic meters that feed the Cuiabá thermal power plant under a 15-year contract. Is interruptible. However, they've consumed this contract almost completely at the full load. So we've used the foundation of 2030 strategic plan and 2014-2018 business management for Petrobras, where they use a renewal of 24 million cubic meters under a take-or-pay contract and 6 million cubic meters under interruptible conditions. With Enarsa, the current contract began in 2007 and is a 21-year contract. And so once again it would have to be negotiated in 2017. Our reference were the projections of the first addenda to the contract between IPFB and Enarsa, which integrate that the total contracted capacity would be increased slowly over time until reaching 27.7 cubic meters in 2027. Okay, these are our results. The great question is, how much is the domestic demand going to grow? And the answer is that would almost triple the domestic demand. As Peter mentioned, we would have relative growth similar to India and China. Why? Because of all the considerations I mentioned before. The company's aggressive policies for increasing domestic consumption. The increase in consumption is the industrial sector and the generation sector. This small drop here is because of the entry into is the implementation of the Rositas hydroelectric plant, and we also have this large Bulu Bulu project. We'll have a consumption almost equal to transportation requirements. Residential natural gas is almost as significant, but we have to think about the social impact of these programs. And domestic consumption goes up 3 times to 7,000 cubic meters per day, but the market for Bolivian natural gas, even with aggressive policies, would still be the same as the external market. Note here, please, Argentina would have as relevant imports as Brazil in the future, in spite of the projections. Bolivia's natural gas exports would still be significant, and with Brazil, we may be very optimistic. Possibly here, the Cuiabá contract might end here, but it could eventually be reviewed. A simple supply-demand balance with accumulated supply, and answering the initial question of whether Bolivia will have the capacity to cover its domestic demand and its international exports. We can see that in order to provision its firm contracts, we would have to develop 2P reserves, current reserves and probable reserves. In the case that Brazil and Argentina would require these interruptible contracts, we would also require 3P reserves. So does this mean that Bolivia couldn't increase its export production to other countries in the future? We would be able to answer this question because, remember, there are 23.4 TCF, either 662 billion cubic meters estimated of undiscovered gas, and 36 TCF, i.e. 1,109 billion cubic meters as technically recoverable shale gas. So if there was strong investment, aggressive investment, these resources could be developed. It would have surplus that it could export to other countries. These are my final remarks for Bolivia. As you see, domestic natural gas consumption would triple by 2013, driven basically by power generation and industrial consumption. However, exports, as I mentioned, will still be the main market for Bolivia. In order to attend future domestic and international markets, Bolivia would have to double its current production capacities, and this would require very large investments in production and exploration. And answering the question of the plenary session, can we expect a shale gas boom in Bolivia? Not so soon, under current conditions. If Bolivia were to open up to export to Chile through the natural gas networks in Argentina, and overcoming the political considerations that Peter mentioned, then this shale gas scenario might occur earlier, but under current conditions, this will only happen at the end of the next decade. However, as I mentioned, there are other markets in the region. And since I have time, I'd like to present some results that our group presented at the New York Congress last year, who focused on oil. In these scenarios, we project the supply demand of oil for different countries in the Andean region, like Peru, which would have a great need to increase its natural gas production to substitute for the demand of oil derivatives. Colombia is in a more comfortable position, but Ecuador will definitely be in trouble in the next decade because its internal demand will overcome its projected production. If we do the same in terms of natural gas, if we do the same exercise I did for Bolivia, Peru, including with its natural gas exports, would still be in a comfortable position. Colombia might need to develop its shale gas reserves at the beginning of the next decade. Ecuador, since its projected demand is very small, it won't have problems with its current reserves in the field it has that supplies its thermal plants, but this would change with a regas plant. When a regas plant comes into operations, it's going to increased demand for natural gas because it's going to substitute for diesel and shale oil. And we have an initiative where we want to model South America with some similar methods as those we used for Bolivia. Currently, demand in the first place, we have demand for Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, for all these countries. The countries in blue are the ones that we already have modeled up to now. The countries that are in yellow are the ones that we would need to model. We're going to finish this by the end of the year. So what's the goal of this? We want to build a times model for Latin America. Times is a minimum cost energy expansion model, and the final objective is to plan natural gas infrastructure, i.e. to plan pipelines, LNG and regas plants, and we're seeking partners in those countries that are still in yellow, so please get in touch with us. Thank you very much. Okay, we have had our three presentations. We started a little later and then we had our logistical difficulties. We're already invading the break, but I think that we need to be a bit flexible. If you prefer to have a quick coffee at the end, we can have a couple of questions, and that's why I've invited the panel members to sit up front to listen to some questions. What I ask you is, please ask questions and don't make presentations. We need very concrete questions, and I'm going to ask the panelists to give very quick questions to be able to have questions from 2 or 3 participants. So the floor is open. I'm going to speak in Spanish. All three mentioned the development of non-conventionals in Brazil, in Bolivia, and outside in North America, but I would like to know your opinion if you believe that in the next 10 years there's a real concrete possibility for developing non-conventionals in our region. It's been presented that Bolivia has enormous potential, that it could in fact export, but I'd like to know your opinion if it's possible, if this is a real possibility. Talking about the Andean region, which is the region that we've studied the most, Peru in 2011 discovered shale gas deposits. A company called Maple did this, for example. But more than an issue of resources, it was a market issue. The lack of infrastructure that Sylvie mentioned would also be a problem for allocating this natural gas. There are markets that require natural gas that could absorb this shale gas production, like Chile, which is an important market. But I think that political issues are a key factor to be able to develop this integration. The problem is basically where we can place that supply of shale gas and where it can be integrated with the demand.
Gas production in Argentina. Whether it can be significantly expanded is another question maybe, but there's a lot of demand, repressed demand in Argentina, so it's a good condition and there is already infrastructure. So Argentina is certainly a case where I would say yes, there is already and it can be increased significantly over the next 10 years. Looking at Brazil, I wouldn't be so optimistic. I think in the next 10 years maybe something will start, but not a very significant production in the next 10 years. Lack of infrastructure, existence of other sources of gas also is a question.
Yes, so we also find that Argentina is the most prospective. You've got to have the transport infrastructure, the pipeline infrastructure to get the gas out to market. Just having the resources is not enough. So we've seen this in other countries too. I mean, I'll go back to the Australian case. The place where they're developing, doing the most, there's some shale gas production already is Central Australia, even though it's not the most prospective, because they've got access to the pipelines. You need to have that pipeline infrastructure. You need to have market. You need to have firms, a lot of them are small firms as well, that are doing the experimentation. This seems to be part of the problem in Latin America. But Argentina, again, I agree. And we had some increase in production in Brazil. A lot of that is the offshore. I would actually think, giving your presentation, that an interesting thing for Brazil to look at would be how floating LNG develops, given the cost of the pipelines to get it ashore. If floating LNG develops, well, maybe you've already got the regas facilities, you've got the gas offshore. That would be interesting.
Well, Peter was very clear about the inefficiencies of gas trading in the region, particularly the case of Chile with its neighborhood. And we see that the resources are there. We lack some infrastructure. So my question to Sylvie and to Mauro is regarding what you think is needed to get that political will to move forward with a real energy integration in the region that is more efficient.
Well, there will be a section on energy integration, so I don't want to rob the but I think I was a big fan of energy integration. I think there are synergies and efficiencies to be had, but with the decreasing cost of LNG, it doesn't seem so strange nowadays to have regasification, to have a network of regasification and liquefaction plants that might not be far away from each other. I mean, Peter was just saying, Brazil has got a lot of offshore gas. It could use its regasification plants to actually transport it inside the country. And I think in the case of Chile and Peru, it's not just an institutional arrangement that's lacking. You know, it's sort of like a history of political enmities. It's going to be difficult to overcome. In the case of Chile and Argentina, it's going to take a lot of time to actually heal the wounds of the cutting of the gas. And I think because of that, and you're Chilean, you can tell me I'm wrong, because of that Chile will continue to rely more on LNG than on its neighbors. And if it finds some gas in the south, maybe that also will help. But I don't see why Chile should go back and think about integration nowadays.
I would like to look at what's possible in the short term. However, from my own experience with the government, I've seen some initiatives that indicated or proposed this. However, there's a lot of political resistance. For example, I heard that there were LNG exports that weren't reported transparently, but which are being sent to Chile. They said that it was going to Spain, but in fact, physically, it was going to Chile. They said, but in truth, what was required that government officials would have to go to the government and give declarations. So I don't think it's possible in the short term. We would need a more integrationist mindset like in Europe, and I think that the politicians in this region don't really have any initiatives in the sense. Now the Bolivia case, I think, is more feasible than the Peruvian case, but Chile would have to give something in return from their point of view. I don't agree or disagree. I just want to say things as they are, and it's a geopolitical condition of Bolivia, so that Bolivia can have access to the sea, and that's their point of view.
Prices in South America, because you have prices for Bolivian gas to Brazil and to Argentina, and you also have the prices that Chile has to pay for LNG. And now there is also a possibility that some of this gas that Chile is imported goes to Argentina through the old pipelines that were available before. So how do you expect all these prices can evolve in the future, considering the projections that Peter did on the global model?
So we did a study. I guess you're referring here partly to Bolivia. So we did one study where we looked at our model. Are there truly very many rents associated with natural gas development in Bolivia? Do they really have a great margin where they could sort of charge more higher price to their neighbours and make more money out of that, and by restricting supply, for example? And what we found is that actually there are not very many rents there at all. It may look like they have a lot of rents, but they don't. If you try to raise prices, there's a lot of LNG, there's the world LNG price, and the LNG comes in. So there's not nearly as many rents as people might think. I think that's part of what you're getting at. So at the end of the day, like in our model, when you're importing gas through LNG, that basically sets the marginal price.
Tenemos a Gerardo, por favor.
Gerardo, please. Yes, a question for Mauro. In the model, the demand projection, the demand forecast you showed for Bolivia, we saw the difficulties that Bolivia is going to have to cover all its markets. But what I thought was interesting was the marginal role that you give to residential consumption. Take into account, one, the social policies that Bolivia is implementing today, and two, that Bolivia isn't a warm country, especially in the area of La Paz and El Alto. It's usually very cold climate, and the gas could be used for heating. We looked at specific consumption, cooking, for studies in Bolivia. Water heating costs were benchmarked against other countries of the region like Peru and Colombia. Heating, as I mentioned, wasn't taken into account. But in truth, yes, in La Paz, it would be a significant consumption. We would have to adjust the model there. However, I don't think that we can develop the pipelines like Argentina has, for example. I might be wrong. I'd like to have your feedback from the Argentinian experience for the expansion of pipelines and the massification of natural gas for residential. Please talk about this off-site, yeah. One last question.
One of the key drivers in your demand projections, your consumption projection, is population. And I was thinking, the case of Chile, for example, we're one of the largest energy consumers per capita in the region, but most of the energy goes to the industry and to the mining sector. Okay, so you have some other sort of drivers for energy consumption that can account for the sort of industry that you have, or...
Yeah, so the other big thing, we split our demand into the power sector and industrial and then commercial residential. So in a lot of these countries, the big driver is the power sector for natural gas. So, but the demand for power also depends on population. So what I'm sort of saying is what really makes a difference in our sort of world model, the world demand for natural gas, is where you have these large population countries developing, and it increases the standard of living. So that as the standard of living goes up, in particular the demand for power goes up, and if you have a large number of people demanding increased electricity generation, that really ramps up the demand for natural gas. The power sector is very important there.
Bueno, yo me reservo la última pregunta, hago un ejercicio así autoritario.
Good, that's the last question. Here it's a question about what wasn't talked about. You didn't talk about Mexico. The Mexican energy reform has three foundations: deep water, non-conventional, and mature fields. The non-conventional fields in Chicotepec are one of the main goals if we think about the geology should be developed. And I did see in any of the panelists mention over the past 10 years, Mauro especially, and he mentioned that Mexico could, I don't know if in the boom, but at least in have a participation in non-conventionals in the region's production. So I'd like a final analysis of Mexico, please.
Certainly, I could have said a lot about Mexico. When I went down to the regional level, I just focused on basically Central and South America. But we tend to classify Mexico in with North America in our analysis.
But this is Latin America.
Of course. But from the point of view of the market, you've got a pipeline connection with the US and Canada. So the way our model works, you kind of develop Mexico in conjunction with the United States and Canada. So, basically, when I interpreted regionally, I guess I looked at Central and South America, but not Mexico. But certainly, lots of interesting opportunities in Mexico with deep water offshore. There's a lot of conventional tight gas, and then, of course, there's unconventional gas. And everyone's very, very optimistic, I think, with the reforms going on in Mexico, that there will be players who are going to be very interested. I've been to some seminars in Mexico. A lot of small companies are very interested in trying to get into the sector with the new rules. Everyone's waiting to understand exactly what the rules are going to be and so on, but there are a lot of small production companies in the same geology that you've got in Texas just continues across the border. The same geology you've got in the Gulf of Mexico on the US side continues across the border. There are a lot of companies that know a lot about that geology, are very confident. They know how to exploit the resources in Mexico, but everyone's waiting to see exactly how the rules work out, under the new law.
There's that, and I would say also that the low oil price environment we have now today is going to impact the result of the first round. And I've seen an analysis, not my analysis, but I've been to a conference, and there was a specialist on Mexico that was saying that probably offshore opportunities will be the one that will be more sought after, and onshore unconventional will be the last one because of there are still challenges and cost issues that may delay those.
Okay, perfect. Bueno, La mala noticia es que les queda...
Okay, the bad news is that you have 5 minutes of break left, but I think that we've had a very good session here. So I'd like a round of applause for our panel members, and thank you very much for your interventions from the floor.